Good morning again, my friends, and those who are watching online, those who will watch at another date. Thank you for being here. It's I always tell people that community is medicinal, and some of us feel wired to want to be alone. I'm one of those people. I said that after the pandemic was over, I was going to return to being an introvert by choice. And that I sort of got the rhythm of being by myself a lot, but it's good to gather together. It's good to be encouraged by one another. I want to share some things today. Well, first, we were going to do, normally I would do a little time for all ages. I would speak to the children, and since we had the moving up moment today, I didn't get to share with them what I was planning on sharing, so I'm going to share it with you. Actually, I think it will resonate with you probably better than them. This, you know what this is, right? It's a pair of eyeglasses. Actually, it's an eyeglass case. That's an important distinction because there's nothing in here. There should be glasses in here, and there are not, and I don't know where they are. I know where they're not. They're not in my car. They were not in my car the 12th time I looked, or the 348th time I looked. They're also not in the vegetable crisper. Don't ask me how I know this. Don't ask me how I know that they're not in my daughter's sock drawer. And don't ask me how I know that they're not in a Rubbermaid container in the attic that I haven't looked at in 10 years. So I've checked everywhere these are supposed to be, and I've lost them. I've resigned. I've retraced my steps. I've answered all the terrible questions like, when do you last remember having them? Because if I knew that, I'd probably have them. So, and I was thinking about the irony that the thing that would help me find these glasses, or if I had my glasses on, because everything looked dim and dark. And I was thinking about loss this week and realizing that I had lost something before I lost these glasses. I lost the ability to see. And so today we're going to talk about the things that we lose. You know, most of us have the experience of driving by a funeral procession on the road with all the lights flashing. And we learn really young, especially when we're starting to drive, what that means. That procession of cars means that we pull over, or that when we're going through an intersection, that we defer to that procession of cars. It's one of the few perks of mourning that we offer. It's a sign of respect to the person who has died. It's an acknowledgement publicly that we should err on the side of grieving people, because that kind of pain is unprecedented, and that kind of pain is a pain that we don't want to be holding. And in the moment we see those cars, we know that someone is holding a pain that they can't avoid. And in a similar way, we might be doing something during the day, going to the grocery store, or heading to the pool, or dropping off the kids, and we might pass by a cemetery or a funeral home, and we feel that moment, we get that twinge of heartbreak for them, or we feel solidarity with strangers, because we know that they're sitting in a place of profound sadness and loss. They are someplace we are grateful not to be. And we realize that life is like that, that there is joy and grieving happening simultaneously all around us. And there are funerals happening all around us today. There is mourning in this very room. There is mourning in the rooms of those who are watching us today. The living are all grieving. I've shared the story with you before. Many of you know my father died 8 years ago. He died very suddenly. And the first few moments of that experience are burned into my brain in such a way that few things are. I can remember running down the stairs, heading to the gym, and seeing my phone ring and seeing my brother's name and thinking, that's strange because he doesn't call all that often. And I can remember the conversation, and I can remember falling to the ground in front of my house and just crying into the grass. And I remember staring at that grass. And then I remember, which I've told some of you this story before, but a couple of hours later, I found myself at the grocery store buying bananas. And I remember thinking to myself, this is madness. This is crazy. Your father just died. What are you doing at the grocery store buying bananas? And I remember thinking, well, tomorrow's going to come. We're going to need bananas, and we don't have any. And so I wanted to make sure that I prepared. I was doing that because when loss happens, we have to live defiantly in the face of it. Things still need to get done. And even though I needed bananas, I really needed normalcy. I needed the muscle memory of the life before I knew my father had passed. And in those first few days after he died, I became what I have since referred to as grief zombies. I became a grief zombie in those first few days, walking around in this haze of sometimes searing pain and sometimes absolute numbness. I would be sucker punched by sadness one minute and then overwhelmed with gratitude in another. And even though I was grieving, I had to continue to do stuff. I had to take the kids to school. I had to get groceries. I had to go to the gym, partly because these things needed to get done and partly because those mundane, ordinary things helped keep me from completely losing it in the face of the insanity of my reality. And so I navigated parking lots, and I waited in restaurant lines, and I sat on park benches, and I did so all the while pushing back tears and fighting to keep going, and in general, just being seconds away from completely breaking down. And I remember wanting to make a sign for myself that said, I just lost my dad, please go easy. Because other than my bloodshot eyes, if you had gotten really close, or if you listened for the break in my voice, you wouldn't know that I was experiencing a complete existential shift because I'd lost the person I loved the most in the world and looked up to the most. And while I didn't want to physically wear my actual circumstances on my chest, I knew that if I did, if I had such a sign, I know people would probably give me space. They'd speak softer to me. They'd move carefully around me. And it would probably have made the impossible almost more bearable. And as I asked that question 8 years ago, what if I could let people know what I was going through? Even as I thought about that idea, I was aware of the acute blindness that I usually live with toward people and their grief. The ego that existed in me now wanting special treatment. Why did I think I was so unique? Why was my pain any more pressing than anyone else's? Why did I assume that everybody but me was all right as I moved through the world? Why did I expect everyone around me to be any sturdier than I feel right now? And so it was in those early days of my grieving and in the time since in doing this very public work that I began to realize just how many grieving people I was driving by and shopping beside and sitting beside, and that it wasn't just limited to the death of a loved one. Friends, to live here and to love well is to lose something. Every single human being is moving through this life while mourning a letting go. Every one of us in this room is letting go of something in these moments. It might be someone we love. But we might be letting go of our old story about faith or our former image of country. Or we might be letting go of the mythology that we had of our family. We might be letting go of the assurance of the goodness of all people. We might be letting go of a once treasured relationship that is now severed. We might be letting go of our physical health. We might be letting go of financial security. We might be letting go of our optimism about the future. But everyone around you, the people you share the grocery store line with, the people you pass in traffic and sit next to at work, and yes, yell at on social media, and the people sitting in the kitchen with you, they're all experiencing the collateral damage of being human. They're all grieving someone, missing someone, worried about someone. Their marriages are struggling, or their mortgage payment is late, or they're waiting on a child's test results, or they're getting bananas a few hours after losing someone they love. Every human being, whether you like them or not, whether you find them pleasant or not, whether you feel you have anything in common with them or not, every single human being is fighting to find peace and to push back fear and to push back sadness, to get through their daily tasks without breaking down wherever they happen to be. I've heard from thousands of people since doing this work very publicly who are now grieving the relational fractures caused by the realities exposed by our political and religious and social divides. Many of you are grieving the proximity that you used to have with people, the tables that are now less full than they had been, the calls that come less frequently, the people who you now speak to only on the surface and never about the deeper things. There is an attrition that comes with age, isn't there? A subtraction that accompanies time here. We gain things as we get older, right? We know that. We gain experiences and wisdom and new understandings, but those things come at a cost. We all have our stories altered by circumstances. We get diagnoses that we weren't expecting. We experience failures. We begin to lose closeness with people that we love. We begin to forget the optimism of our past. I've always liked to be alone, and I used to go in the woods. When I used to walk in the woods, I was about 10 or 11 years old. For hours, I would just get a backpack and get some, peanut butter sandwich and some comic books, and I would just go into the woods, and I just loved being alone. And I can remember distinctly more than one occasion walking as I was around 10 or 11 and thinking to myself, or sort of giving myself this sort of pep talk. And I remember saying, wow, life is going to be so great. I remember saying, look, at your life is all out in front of you, because people used to say that to me. That was 42 years ago or so. And now I'm thinking about the fact that I no longer have all that time out in front of me. In fact, it's likely that I have more time in the rearview mirror than I have left in the windshield, right? Unless I get really lucky. And so I've been thinking about the losses that I accrued in those 42, 43 years that I was not prepared for. And it's a good thing, because that allowed me to be optimistic involuntarily, but now I have to choose it. There are days when I have to choose hope because of what I've been through, and you too. As you get older, things break down. Our cars, our hips, our emotional states. We suffer unwanted changes in different lines, our waistlines, our hairlines, our bottom lines, right? We end up eulogizing family members. We end up eulogizing former relationships. We end up eulogizing dreams we had. And I think this awareness of the universal nature of loss is key to us having empathy. Because the people around us, they're probably not going to be shrouded in black. They're probably not going to have bands on their arms. They're not going to be driving in processions of cars that show us who they are. There's not going to be a lot that's going to give away their trauma. but their pain is profound, and their wounds are often tender and residing just below the surface. And this is especially important to remember as we encounter people's unpleasantness, because often what presents as hatred or looks like anger is just the mourning trying to break through the facade of competency that we all work so hard to keep up. No one wants to admit when they're struggling, because in the moment, we all believe in the myth of other people's okayness. So everyone else seems to be fine. I remember when I was grieving my father's loss, everyone seemed happy. And I remember feeling that there was a solitary nature to that grieving. Because you'd say, "How are you?" And people say, "I'm good." So you'd believe them. And they'd ask you, "How are you?" And you'd say, "Good," but you were lying. And there's something helpful about acknowledging the universal grief because it's an equalizer. It is a source of complete affinity with other people, regardless of what they believe or what they have or the things that they do. See, the scars that we acquire here, they're profoundly nonpartisan, and they transcend religious worldview, don't they? And no matter how much we try to fortify ourselves, no matter how brave a face we fake, no matter how defensively we try and live, no matter how earnest our faith is, no one here is exempt from the collateral damage of being human. So if people around us are all grieving, then what do we do? How do we respond to all that sadness? Well, how do we respond to people when they're mourning? How do we respond to people at funerals? If you've ever gone to a funeral or a viewing and you walk in, the first thing you do is you look for those mourners. And you see that family and you prepare your heart and you're trying to figure out, what can I say because I want to make them feel better. I want to bring them comfort. And so some things we should do to the mourners. We treat them with gentleness. We understand that they're not at their best, so we give them the benefit of the doubt. We see their behavior, we see them responding in a way that feels unnatural to us, and we realize they're going through trauma right now. You know what we also do with mourners? We usually put aside our issues with them. We don't get into the petty bickering because we know that there is something more important happening. And most importantly, when we see the mourners, we assume a posture of a caregiver. What if we were able to do this with everyone without needing to know the details of their loss? What if we moved through this life and decided to become members of a receiving line of people experiencing trauma? How might we change if we could defer to people as if they were driving in a funeral procession past us? And this is important, friends. We need to be mindful of our own grieving too. The things we are sitting in vigil over, our losses, our disappointments, our letting goes. So we need to save some of that kindness for ourselves. We need to have that posture of gentleness toward ourselves when we fail and when we get easily angered and we realize, hey, maybe this isn't about the dishes that somebody left on the sink, in the sink. Maybe this is about how sad I am, how frustrated I am. A good friend of mine said to me, he said, "John, if I look back on the last few years of your life, I can see the scale of your losses." He said, "I know you." And he said, "You lost your job." He said, "You lost your father." And he said, "You lost your community when you moved and lost that job." He said, "You lost that all in the span of a year. How long do you think it should take you to get over that loss?" And I hadn't thought about it. But then I thought about all the stories of people I knew, and it was the same for them. We don't go through this life unscathed, do we? And this doesn't need to be a somber, depressing idea, even though it feels heavy. Because there's always some joy, and there's always some celebration, and there's always some gratitude in the midst of grieving, isn't there? We don't have to be somber, but we have to be aware. recently I've been reminded that I am surrounded by grief zombies all the time. And they may not be mourning the loss of a parent, but they might be parents whose children are sick, and they might be couples in the middle of a relational struggle. They might be kids being bullied at school. They might be teenagers who feel that life is hopeless, and they might be families who don't know how they're going to keep the lights on. And none of them wear signs that say, fragile, handle with care. And since they don't, and since you don't, it's up to you and me to look more closely, more deeply at everyone around us, at work or at the gas station or in the produce section, and to never assume that they're all right. Never assume they aren't just hanging by a thread. We need to remind ourselves just how hard the stories around us might be, and to approach each person as a delicate, breakable, invaluable treasure and go easy. The loss here is universal. The trauma is prolific. There are 8 billion funerals happening right now. And if we lean hard into this truth, I think we can trace the source of our own trauma. We can face our own mortality. We can awaken to the wounds of the world. And most importantly, we can be agents of healing and hope right now amid the mourners. So life is fragile. Hold it carefully. People are fragile. Handle them gently. And you are fragile, so take it easy.